The chair scraped against the warped porch boards at exactly 9 o'clock, same as every night for the past 3 weeks. Solène Navarre pressed her back against the inside of her door, palms flat against the rough-hewn wood, listening to the familiar creak of his weight settling into that ladder-back chair he'd dragged from somewhere and left outside like a permanent fixture. Like he belonged there. Like he had any right. "I know you're awake," Owen Keller said through the door, his voice low and unhurried, as if they were having a perfectly normal conversation and not conducting it through 2 inches of pine and a world of hurt. "I can see the candle light under the door." Solène pressed her lips together and said nothing. She had gotten very good at saying nothing. "That's all right," he continued. "You don't have to talk. I'm not going anywhere." She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the door open and tell him exactly what she thought of him, of his quiet persistence, of the way he sat out there in the dark like some kind of patient, sorrowful ghost when he had no right to be patient and no right to be sorrowful, because he was the one who had broken everything. He was the one with the dark past he'd never seen fit to disclose. He was the one who had stood in Judge Harriman's courtroom 6 days ago and let her discover, in front of every soul in Caldera Creek, that the man she had been falling in love with was the same man who had ridden with the Crane gang 11 years ago, before pinning on a badge and burying that fact so deep he thought it would stay buried forever. He had not told her. He had not trusted her with it. That was the betrayal that cut the deepest. She blew out the candle and walked to her bedroom in the dark. Outside, he did not move. She could hear the occasional shift of wood, the soft sound of him breathing in the night air of the Arizona Territory, the distant chorus of coyotes rolling down from the Red Mesa. He sat there until nearly midnight every single night, and then he walked the 2 blocks back to the sheriff's office and slept on his cot. And in the morning he was at his desk before sunrise with the same quiet, contained expression on his face, and the whole town of Caldera Creek watched and waited and whispered. It had started 6 weeks before that night in the courtroom, which meant it had started in a place that felt now like a different world entirely. A gentler one. Caldera Creek, Arizona Territory, 1883. Population 412 souls, plus however many drifters pass through on the stage road between Tucson and the silver mines at Benson. The town had a single main street with a general store, a livery, a hotel that doubled as a saloon on its lower floor, a church, a schoolhouse, a doctor's office, and the sheriff's office with its 2 jail cells that rarely held anyone more dangerous than a cowhand who drunk too much rye. It was a town trying very hard to believe in its own respectability, and Owen Keller was a large part of the reason it could. He had come to Caldera Creek 4 years before Solène arrived, stepping off the stage with a single saddlebag and a letter of introduction from the territorial marshal that described him as the most capable lawman in the southern Arizona Territory. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples and gray eyes the color of winter sky. He was quiet in the manner of men who have seen enough to understand that noise usually makes things worse. He kept a clean office. He was fair to everyone, which in 1883 Arizona Territory was not as simple as it sounded, because fair meant fair to the Mexican families who'd been on that land for 3 generations, and fair to the few Apache men who came in from the San Carlos Reservation to trade at the general store, and fair to the Chinese laborers who worked the road crews. And fair was not a quality everyone in Caldera Creek admired in their sheriff. But Owen Keller had a way of making people feel that arguing with him would be more trouble than it was worth, and so they let him be fair, and mostly the town was peaceful, and the badge on his chest gleamed in the desert sun, and nobody knew what it covered. Solène Navarre arrived on a Tuesday in early March, on the stage from Tucson, with 2 trunks, a sewing case, and the particular kind of careful composure that belongs to people who have arranged their faces into masks and worn them so long the masks have begun to feel like skin. She was 28 years old. She had dark auburn hair and dark eyes and the straight, contained bearing of a woman who had learned to take up exactly as much space as was necessary and no more. She was French Creole by heritage, born in New Orleans, and she had come to the Arizona Territory from St. Louis, where she had spent 3 years working as a seamstress in a dress shop and trying to forget the husband who had died and left her with debts and a grief she didn't know how to carry in a city full of people who knew her face. Caldera Creek was nobody's first choice of destination. That was what she liked about it. She had arranged by letter with a woman named Clara Hatch, who owned the general store, to take over the small adobe house on the east edge of town that Clara's late mother had occupied. The rent was reasonable. There was a room at the front of the house that got good morning light, and Solène intended to set up a dressmaking and alterations business there, which Clara Hatch told her in a letter was desperately needed since the nearest proper seamstress was 30 miles away in Benson. She did not expect much. She had stopped expecting much 3 years ago. What she did not expect, specifically, was the sheriff. She met him on her second day in town, when she went to Clara's general store to buy thread and lamp oil and introduce herself properly. Owen Keller was at the counter, paying for a tin of coffee, and Clara Hatch introduced them with the enthusiastic matchmaking energy that small-town storekeepers across the American West seem to produce naturally, like a regional resource. Solène Navarre, this here is Owen Keller, our sheriff. Owen, this is the seamstress I told you about, come all the way from St. Louis. Owen turned from the counter and looked at her with those gray eyes, and he said, "Welcome to Caldera Creek, Miss Navarre," in a voice that was calm and genuine and not performing anything, and Solène felt something shift very slightly in her chest, like a door she'd thought was permanently stuck moving an inch on its hinges. She said, "Thank you, Sheriff," and looked away and bought her thread and her lamp oil, and told herself that shift in her chest was nothing more than the dry desert air after years of Missouri humidity. The weeks that followed were quiet and ordered in the way she liked. She unpacked her trunks. She arranged her sewing room. She put up a small hand-painted sign on the post outside her door that read Navarre Alterations and Dressmaking, and within a week she had 4 clients, because Clara Hatch was the best advertisement in the territory. She learned the rhythms of the town, the way the stage came through on Tuesdays and Fridays, the way the church bell rang at 7 and noon and 6, the way the desert evenings turned colors she had never imagined possible, deep golds and burned oranges and purples so vivid they looked painted by someone showing off. She saw Owen Keller often enough because the town was small. He tipped his hat when they passed on the street. He held doors. He did not hover or impose himself. He simply existed in her periphery, steady and contained. And she found herself noticing him in the way you notice something that is always precisely where you expect it to be, not because it demands attention, but because its consistency becomes quietly remarkable. The first real conversation happened at the end of March, on an evening when she had stayed too late altering a dress for the hotel owner's wife, and was walking home alone in the blue dusk with her sewing basket over her arm. She heard boots on the boardwalk behind her and turned, and it was Owen, heading the same direction on his evening round. "I'll walk with you," he said, "if you don't mind." She considered him for a moment. "I don't mind." They walked in silence for half a block, and then he said, "How are you finding Caldera Creek?" "Honest," she said. He glanced at her. Honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. I appreciate that. He was quiet a moment, as if turning this over. That's an interesting way to see a dusty little town in the middle of the desert. I've lived in places that spent a great deal of energy pretending, she said. I find I prefer the absence of it. He nodded slowly. I think I know what you mean. They reached her door and she turned to say good night, and he said, "Good evening, Miss Navarre," and walked on. And she watched him go and thought about honesty and pretending and how complicated the line between them could be. She did not know yet how complicated. She would learn. The second conversation, the one that started them in earnest toward each other, happened the first week of April, when a water pipe at the back of her house cracked during an overnight cold snap that nobody had anticipated and flooded her storeroom, soaking 2 bolts of fabric she'd been holding for a client in Benson. She was behind her house at 6 in the morning with a bucket and a look on her face that probably conveyed exactly how she felt about the Arizona Territory's climactic inconsistencies, when Owen Keller came around the corner on his morning walk and stopped. "What can I do?" he said. Not what happened, not that's a shame. Just what can I do? She handed him the second bucket without hesitation, because a man who leads with usefulness is a man worth engaging. And they worked together for 40 minutes in the sharp morning cold until the water was managed, and the pipe caulked with a temporary seal that would hold until the hardware man opened his shop at 8. Then she made coffee on her little cast iron stove and poured it into 2 tin cups, and they sat at her kitchen table, and he held the cup in both hands the way people do when the warmth is the point. And she looked at his hands, which were large and careful looking, and thought he was a man who tried very hard to be gentle. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. Most people would have expressed sympathy and continued walking. "I'm not most people." She studied him over her cup. "No, I've gathered that." He looked back at her without deflection, which was unusual. Most men, she had found, could not hold a direct gaze from a woman they were interested in without performing something: bravado, dismissal, charm. Owen Keller just looked at her like she was a person he was genuinely glad to know. "You've been through something hard," he said. It was not a question, and it was not prying. It was just an observation, offered gently like a lamp held up in a dark hallway. She set down her cup. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," she said. "In St. Louis." "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "I came here to start over," she said. "I don't know if that's possible, but this seems like a place that might allow for it." "It does," he said. "I know something about that." She wanted to ask what he meant. She didn't, because she sensed it was something that needed to arrive on its own time. She understood the shape of things that couldn't be rushed. He finished his coffee, thanked her, and left. And that was the start of it. Through April and into May, they built a friendship in the careful, considered way that 2 private people build things, one honest exchange at a time. He began walking her home in the evenings when their paths aligned, which they aligned with increasing frequency. She began leaving her door open on warm afternoons, so that when he passed on his rounds, he might stop and say a few words from the threshold, which he did, leaning against the door frame with his hat in his hands, easy and unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world and chose to spend small pieces of it here. She learned that he read everything he could get his hands on, that he had a particular devotion to history books, and found them steadying in a way he struggled to articulate beyond saying that it helped to know that difficult times had always existed, and that people had always found ways through them. She learned that he had grown up in Kansas, in a hardscrabble family on the plains, that he'd had a mother he adored, and a father who was absent in the specific way of men who are physically present but emotionally elsewhere. She learned that he had no siblings living, that he had a horse named Theodore that he treated like a partner, and talked to more honestly than he talked to most people, which he admitted with a self-deprecating half-smile that did something complicated to her breathing. He learned that she had grown up between New Orleans and the Louisiana countryside, the daughter of a French Creole merchant, and a woman of African and French heritage, who had been one of the most capable and elegant people Solène had ever known. She told him about the particular social complexity of being a woman of mixed race in the American South, the ways she had learned to navigate spaces that weren't built for her, the walls she'd learned to construct, and the cost of maintaining them. She told him about her husband, Mitchell Navarre, a kind and decent man who had loved her sincerely and died of a fever at 31, leaving her in St. Louis with his debts, and a grief she'd had no community to hold her through it because St. Louis was not New Orleans and nobody knew her there. Owen listened to all of this the way he did everything, completely, without interruption, without the particular masculine impatience that masquerades as listening while actually just waiting for the next thing to say. When she was finished, he said, "That's a great deal to carry alone," and she felt the truth of it more in those 6 words than she had in 2 years of telling herself she was fine. "I'm not alone now," she said, and immediately wondered if she'd said too much. But he just nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable and welcome thing to say. By the middle of May, Caldera Creek had decided they were courting, which they were, in the slow and cautious way of 2 people who have both been hurt by life, and are approaching happiness with the particular care of individuals handling something fragile. He brought her books from the traveling library cart that came through every 3 weeks. She mended a tear in his good coat and refused to take payment for it. He ate Sunday dinner at her kitchen table 3 weeks running. She walked with him in the early mornings sometimes, out to the east edge of town where the mesa caught the first light and turned a color she thought must be what the inside of a flame looks like. She began to trust him. That was the thing that mattered. She had not trusted easily since Mitchell died, had not let herself believe that the world was safe enough for trust. And here was Owen Keller being steady and honest and present and kind in a way that made her walls feel less necessary than they'd felt in years. She did not yet know about the hidden motives she would later fear he might have had. She did not yet know about the dark past under the badge. She did not yet know about the Crane gang. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday at the end of May, on the same stage that usually brought fabric orders and letters. What it brought instead was a man named Harlan Voss, a compact, sharp-eyed man in a good suit who introduced himself as an agent of the territorial prosecutor's office and presented himself at Owen's desk with a folder of documents and a carefully neutral expression. Solène didn't know about Harlan Voss for another week. What she knew was that Owen became quieter. Not cold, not distant in the way of a man retreating from a woman, but internal in a way she recognized as someone carrying a weight they hadn't decided what to do with yet. He still walked with her. He still came to Sunday dinner. But there was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before, something that looked remarkably like dread. She gave him space because she understood the need for it. She told herself he would tell her when he was ready. She was wrong about the timing, though she was not wrong about his intention to tell her. The problem was that Harlan Voss moved faster than Owen's intention. The territorial prosecutor's office had been building a case against the remaining members of the old Crane gang, specifically regarding a series of stage robberies and a killing in 1872 that had gone unsolved. 2 of the gang's surviving members had already been located and were in custody. The 3rd man they needed was going by the name of Owen Keller and had been serving as sheriff of Caldera Creek, Arizona Territory, for 4 years. What Harlan Voss had, and what Owen knew he had, was a sworn statement from one of the men in custody identifying Owen by name as having ridden with the Crane gang between 1871 and 1872. When Owen was 20 years old and desperate and making choices he had spent the next 11 years trying to atone for. What Harlan Voss did not have and could not find was evidence that Owen had participated in the killing, because Owen had not. He had ridden with the gang for 8 months, had participated in one robbery, had been so sickened by it that he'd left the gang and ridden north and spent the next year picking up any honest work he could find before eventually finding his way to the Territorial Marshal's Service at 23, driven by precisely the guilt and self-recrimination that the dark past engenders in people with a conscience. The Territorial Marshal who had hired him knew. Owen had disclosed it to him in full, because he had thought then that honesty was the only way to actually become the person he was trying to be. And the Marshal, a pragmatic man who valued competence and believed in the capacity for human change, had agreed to hold it in confidence while Owen built a record that spoke for itself. That Marshal had died 2 years ago. The confidence had died with him. And now Harlan Voss was in town, and Owen was facing a choice between getting ahead of it and telling Solène himself, or having it arrive the way dark past secrets always eventually arrive, at the worst possible moment, in the most public possible way. He chose to tell her. He decided it on a Friday evening walking her home, intending to ask if he could come in and sit down and tell her everything. He had rehearsed it. He had it ordered. He was going to tell her about the gang and about the robbery, and about the marshal who had given him a chance, and about every year since when he tried to be worthy of that chance. And then he was going to let her decide what she wanted to do with it. Because he had come to understand in the weeks they'd been finding their way toward each other that she was the most important person in his life now, and she deserved the truth of him, not just the polished surface of it. He was going to tell her that Friday evening. On Friday morning, Harlan Voss filed a formal notice with Judge Harriman, and Judge Harriman, who was an efficient and by-the-book man with no particular affection for Owen Keller one way or another, issued a summons for a formal hearing the following Tuesday, and by Friday afternoon, every person in Caldera Creek had heard some version of it, because Caldera Creek was 412 souls and privacy was largely theoretical. Solène heard it from Clara Hatch, who told her with the careful expression of someone delivering news they genuinely wished they didn't have to deliver, at 4 o'clock Friday afternoon, 2 hours before Owen arrived at her door to walk her home. She stood at her sewing table for a long time after Clara left. She stood there until the light changed and the room went gold and then shadow, and she felt something happening in her chest that was too large and too complicated to be simple heartbreak. It was heartbreak, yes, but underneath it was something worse. The specific devastation of realizing that the person you have been opening yourself to, the person you have been letting past walls you spent years building, has been holding something back, has been letting you believe you knew him, has been letting you walk into trust with incomplete information, which is a kind of trap, even when it isn't intended as one. She heard the knock at her front door at 6 o'clock. She did not answer it. He knocked again, gently. "Solène, it's Owen." She pressed her hand against the wall and breathed. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I need to explain something and I need you to let me do it, and then you can tell me whatever you need to tell me. But please let me explain." She didn't answer. She heard him sigh, a low and careful sound, and then she heard him settle into something outside her door, and she realized he had sat down on her porch. He sat there for 2 hours that Friday night. At 8 o'clock she finally went to bed, and at 9 o'clock, when she couldn't sleep, she got up and looked through her window and he was still there, sitting in the dark, not doing anything, just being present in the patient way that was either the most genuine thing she'd ever encountered, or a performance so subtle she couldn't detect it. She went back to bed and lay awake for a long time and thought about betrayal and hidden motives, and the particular cruelty of caring about someone who has kept secrets. The hearing on Tuesday was worse than she'd imagined. It was held in the main room of the hotel, since there was no proper courthouse in Caldera Creek, and every single person in town came. Owen stood before Judge Harriman in his good clothes with the badge on his chest, and Harlan Voss read out the evidence, and Owen did not look away from the judge's face, and he did not try to minimize or deflect. He answered every question directly, confirmed every fact, and said plainly that he had ridden with the Crane gang at 20 years old and had participated in one robbery, and had left the gang because he could not stomach what they were and what they were doing, and had spent the subsequent 11 years trying to become someone different. Solène sat in the back of that room and listened and watched his face and thought, he is telling the truth right now. She could recognize truth in him by now, the particular stillness that settled over him when he wasn't performing anything. He was not performing anything. But she had not been in this room. She had been at her sewing table on Friday afternoon, learning this from Clara Hatch's carefully kind expression, and she had not been the first person he'd trusted with it, and that was the part she could not get past. Judge Harriman ruled that given Owen's subsequent record, and the lack of evidence connecting him to the killing, and given the disclosure that had been made to the original territorial marshal at the time of his hiring, no criminal charges would be brought. Owen Keller could continue as sheriff of Caldera Creek if the town wished to keep him. The town discussed it for approximately 48 hours and then, by general consensus driven largely by Clara Hatch's pointed reminders of every specific instance in which Owen Keller had been honest and competent and fair to everyone equally, decided to keep him. Solène said nothing in the discussion. She was not a long-standing resident of Caldera Creek. It was not her place. What was her place was her adobe house with the sign out front, and the sewing room with the good morning light, and Owen Keller sitting on her porch in the dark every single night, and her own heart, which was more complicated than she knew what to do with. She stayed angry for the first week. It was a clean, clarifying anger, the kind that has a proper target and a proper cause, and she appreciated its simplicity, even as she understood it was only part of what she felt. The other part was grief, because she had been building something with him, building it carefully and with intention, and she had believed she knew the shape of the thing she was building, and now she had to reckon with the fact that the shape was different than she'd thought. She also felt, underneath the anger and the grief, something she did not want to acknowledge yet, which was that she understood. Not that it made it right, not that she forgave it. But she understood the mathematics of it. A man who has run from a dark past and built a new life over the top of it and lives every day with the knowledge that the past is still there, underground, waiting. A man who finally finds someone he wants to stop running from himself for. A man who is trying to find the right moment and the right words and running out of both. She understood it because she had kept her own kind of secrets, not from him specifically, but from the world. She had never told him, for instance, the full story of what it had cost her to be who she was in the places she had been. She had given him portions, carefully selected. She was not, herself, a person of total transparency. The second week was harder than the first, because the anger had quieted enough that the grief and the understanding and the longing were all louder, and she missed him in the specific and maddening way that you miss someone who is right outside your door. He was there every night. 9 o'clock, the scrape of the chair, the careful settling of his weight. He did not knock any more after that first night. He did not call through the door asking to be heard. He simply came and sat, as if presence was all he had to offer, and he was offering it unconditionally, the way a person sits with someone they love when words are inadequate. He left before midnight every night. He was at his desk before sunrise every morning. He nodded to her when they passed on the street. Just a nod. Nothing that asked for anything. Clara Hatch came to see her in the third week with a pot of soup and the particular directness of a woman who has run a general store for 20 years and believes in practical communication. "You know he's dying," Clara said, setting the soup pot on the kitchen table with a decisive clunk. "He's not dying," Solène said. "I have never in my life seen a man eat less and sleep less and look worse and still perform every single one of his duties without a single complaint or error," Clara said. "That man is running on nothing but the knowledge that you're inside that house and still breathing." Solène sat down. "He should have told me, Clara." "Yes," Clara said without qualification, "he should have. He let me believe I knew him." "You do know him," Clara said. "You know the true him. The young fool he was at 20 is not the man he is now, and you know the man he is now better than anyone in this town. He made a choice about what I deserved to know." "He did," Clara said, "and it was wrong." "But Solène, I have watched you not answer that door for 3 weeks, and I want to ask you something. Is it that you think he's a bad man, or is it that you're afraid?" Solène looked at her. "Because those are different things," Clara said gently. "And only one of them is a good reason to keep that door shut." Clara left the soup and went back to her store, and Solène sat at her kitchen table and thought about fear and good reasons, and what it meant to trust someone with the full and complicated weight of yourself. That night she sat on her side of the door and listened to him settle into his chair, and she said for the first time in 3 weeks into the wood between them, "I'm here." There was a pause, then his voice very quiet, "I know." She pressed her palm against the door. "I'm still angry," she said. "You have every right to be," he said. "I'm also," she said, and stopped. "Take your time," he said. She leaned her head against the door. "I'm also," she said again, trying to understand. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was going to tell you that Friday. I had decided. I want you to know that, not because it changes anything, but because it's true and I need you to have the true things." "I believe you," she said, and she did. That was the complicated part. "It was a cowardly thing," he said, "to carry it that long without telling you. I told myself I was waiting for the right time, but the truth is I was afraid of losing you before you were mine to lose, and that was selfish. I know it." She closed her eyes. "What were you like at 20?" she asked. Not as a challenge, as a real question. He thought about it. "Angry," he said. "Hungry in a way I didn't have words for. My father had left and my mother was sick and I had nothing and no direction, and the Crane Gang was the first community I'd had in 2 years. I know that's not an excuse." "I'm not asking for an excuse," she said. "I'm asking what you were like." "Lost," he said. "I was lost. And when I left them and found my way to the Marshal Service, I felt, for the first time, like the person I was supposed to be, like I'd found the thing I was for. And I thought that maybe I could build over the lost part, build something solid enough that it would hold." "And does it hold?" she asked. "It held until you," he said, and there was something raw in his voice. "And then I wanted it to hold in a different way. I wanted it to hold because you knew all of it and still thought it was sound. That's the thing I was looking for when I decided to tell you. I wanted the truth between us because that felt like the only thing worth having." She was quiet for a long time. "I'm not ready," she said finally. "To open this door, I'm not ready yet." "I know," he said. "But I hear you," she said. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." He sat until midnight. She sat on the floor inside the door until 10 o'clock, and then she went to bed and slept better than she had in 3 weeks. The conversations through the door became their new pattern, not every night but often. She would speak first, or he would speak first, and they talked in a way they hadn't talked before, with the kind of unguarded honesty that the closed door somehow made easier. As if the wood between them removed the pressure of being seen and left only the simpler act of being heard. She told him things she hadn't told him. About the years before Mitchell, about the ways she had been dismissed and overlooked and occasionally endangered simply for existing in a body that made certain people in certain places feel entitled to opinions about her worth. She told him about a particular incident in St. Louis, a landlord who had tried to use her financial vulnerability after Mitchell's death as leverage, and the way she had handled it, which had required a combination of legal knowledge she'd had to acquire quickly, and a composure she had not felt while performing it. She told him about the loneliness of grief in a city where you had no deep roots, the specific suffocation of mourning in public while maintaining the face of a woman who was coping. He listened. He said, when she finished, "I am sorry the world has required you to be so strong so often when you deserve to be held." She put her hand on the door again. It was becoming a habit. He told her about the years between the gang and the badge, the itinerant years of odd jobs and drifting, and the persistent feeling that he was serving time in his own conscience. He told her about the marshal who had given him the chance, a man named Amos Webb, who had told him that a man's past was a fact, but his character was an ongoing decision. He told her about the first arrest he'd ever made, a cattle rustler twice his size, and how his hands had shaken afterward, not from fear but from the enormity of being, for the first time in his life, on the right side of something. "I have tried every day since to stay on the right side," he said. "I have not always succeeded, but I have never stopped trying." "I know," she said through the door. "Do you?" he asked, not challenging, hoping. "I know your character," she said. "I knew it before I knew the rest. The rest is—" She paused. "The rest is the shape of how you became the man I know. It doesn't change the man I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "But the not telling was a wound," she said. "It's not healed yet. But I understand what it came from, and I believe what you told me about the Friday you were going to tell me. Those things are true and they matter." "Then what do you need?" he asked. "To heal it." She thought about this seriously. "I need to trust you again," she said. "Not in theory. In practice, I need to rebuild it." "Tell me what that looks like," he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I think it looks like this," she said. "These conversations, you coming and sitting and not demanding anything. Time. Then I will come and sit every night until you tell me to stop," he said, "and I won't demand anything." "I know," she said. "That's the other thing, the fact that you've been doing this, just coming and sitting." She paused. "It says something." "What does it say?" "That you're not going anywhere," she said. "That you're not giving up because I'm difficult, that you're—" She stopped. "What?" he asked gently. "Faithful," she said quietly. "It says you're faithful, and I haven't had a great deal of that in my life." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I am faithful to you," he said, "completely and permanently. That is not a conditional thing." She pressed both hands flat against the door. "Good night, Owen," she said. "Good night, Solène," he said. He sat another hour in the dark before walking back to the jail. The following week brought a disruption to Caldera Creek that temporarily shifted everyone's attention, which was the arrival of two brothers named Cole and Preston Marsh, drifters of the antagonistic variety who had been making their way through small Arizona Territory towns, leaving a trail of trouble. They arrived on a Wednesday, and by Thursday had managed to start a fight at the hotel saloon. intimidate the Chinese road laborers camped at the edge of town, and make a series of remarks to Solène in the general store that were designed to be simultaneously threatening and legally ambiguous. Solène handled it herself, turning from the fabric counter with an expression so controlled and precisely devastating that Cole Marsh took half a step back despite himself. She said nothing to him. She simply looked at him with the particular gaze of a woman who has been underestimated by more formidable men than him, and turned back to her business. She didn't tell Owen. Owen found out anyway, because Clara Hatch told him, and he came to the general store and spoke with Cole and Preston Marsh with such quiet and deliberate authority that they were on the stage to Benson the following morning without anyone raising a hand. He did not tell them to leave. He told them, with complete composure, exactly what would happen if they remained in Caldera Creek and continued their current pattern of behavior. And his certainty was so absolute that the brothers apparently decided they had better options elsewhere. Solène watched from across the street as the stage pulled away. Owen turned and found her watching, and they looked at each other across the dusty main street in the bright morning light, and she felt something shift again in her chest, but this time it wasn't a door on its hinges. This time it was a lock. She was not ready yet, but she was getting there. A week after the Marsh brothers left, in the warm first days of June, a letter came for Solène on the Tuesday stage. It was from her cousin in New Orleans, and it contained news that sat her down in her sewing chair for a long time. Her mother's oldest friend, a woman named Cecile who had been the closest thing to an aunt that Solène had died at the end of May after a short illness. She and Cecile had corresponded irregularly since Mitchell's death, and Cecile had been one of the last threads connecting her to the life before, to the women who had known her mother, to the language and warmth of New Orleans that she sometimes felt like a phantom limb. She sat with the letter and felt the grief, which was different from heartbreak, more quiet and more deep, the kind of grief that accumulates rather than strikes. That evening, when Owen settled into his chair, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "I got bad news today. Someone I cared about died." "I'm sorry," he said. "Do you want to tell me about her?" And she told him about Cecile, about New Orleans, about her mother and the women who had surrounded her mother and what that circle had meant. She talked for longer than she'd intended, past the part where she'd told him what he needed to know and into the part where she was simply talking because the talking was helping, because his presence on the other side of the door was warm and steady and real. When she finished, there was a comfortable silence. "Solène," he said carefully, "I know you're not ready, and I am not going to push, but if you ever need to not be alone on a hard night, I want you to know that the offer is always there. You can open the door any time. Not for any other reason than that you shouldn't have to be alone with grief if you don't want to be." She looked at the door. She thought about that lock she'd heard turning in her chest a week ago on the main street. She stood up. She crossed the room. She put her hand on the latch. She opened the door. Owen Keller looked up at her from the ladder-back chair he'd placed on her porch, and the expression on his face in that moment was not triumph or relief or vindication. It was simply, purely, the look of a person who has been allowed to come back to the place they belong. Careful and grateful and still. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He stood from the chair slowly, as if moving too quickly might break something, and he stepped inside her house, and she closed the door behind him, and they sat at her kitchen table with coffee, and she told him more about Cecile and her mother and New Orleans, and he listened with the completeness he always brought to listening, and at 10 o'clock he said good night and went back to the jail, and the ladder-back chair stayed on her porch because she didn't ask him to take it. Everything that followed moved like the desert after rain, slowly at first and then all at once. green and sudden and overwhelming in the best possible way. The next evening he knocked and she opened the door, and they sat on the porch together in the warm evening air, her in her rocking chair and him in his ladder-back chair. And they watched the stars come out over the mesa and talked about nothing particularly important, and it felt like everything. On Sunday he came for dinner, and she cooked properly. Not the simple meals she'd made when they were tentative, but a real Sunday dinner with a braised chicken and cornbread, and a peach cobbler she'd been practicing since March. And he ate with the quiet appreciation of a man who has not had anyone cook for him with intention in a very long time. "This is the best meal I've had since I came to Caldera Creek," he said. "That seems unlikely," she said. "Clara Hatch is a very good cook." "Clara Hatch cooks with efficiency," he said. "This is different. This is cooking with love." She looked up from her plate and found him watching her with that direct gray gaze, and she said, "I suppose it is," and neither of them looked away for a long moment. He helped her clear the table afterward, which was not nothing in 1883, and she watched him move around her kitchen with the particular ease of someone who has decided not to be careful anymore, and she thought, "There it is. That is what I was afraid to have. That easy, familiar thing." She was not afraid of it anymore. It was Clara Hatch who eventually said what the whole town had apparently been thinking, appearing at the counter of her general store one morning in late June when Solène came in for supplies, looking at her with bright, satisfied eyes and saying, "You let him in, Clara," Solène said. "I'm not prying," Clara said. "I'm celebrating. This town has watched that man put a chair on your porch for 6 weeks, and that is the most romantic thing that has happened in Caldera Creek since Bill Pearson proposed to Dorothea May with a flower he stole from her own front yard." Solène had to work very hard not to smile. "It's early yet," she said. "It is not early," Clara said firmly. "It is exactly on time." She was, as usual, correct. Owen came to dinner on Tuesday, and on Thursday they walked together out to the mesa in the early evening, climbing the gentle slope of red rock to where the view opened up, and you could see the whole valley below, the tiny grid of Caldera Creek and the stage road threading south toward Tucson, and the mountains going purple in the distance. They stood side by side, and the wind came up the valley and moved through her hair, and he put his hand at the small of her back, just lightly, just the warmth of his palm, and she leaned very slightly into it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are we courting?" he said. "I want to be sure I'm not assuming something that isn't true." She looked at him, this man with his gray eyes and his quiet gravity and his dark past and his faithful heart, and she said, "Owen, you sat on my porch every night for 6 weeks. I think we passed courting some time ago." He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she'd never seen him do before, which was smile fully. Not the restrained half-smile she'd gotten used to, but a complete and unguarded smile that changed his whole face and made him look briefly like the 20-year-old boy he'd been before everything went complicated. "All right," he said. "Good." She laughed, and he looked delighted by the sound of it, and the wind came up again from the valley, and she thought, "This is what I came here for, not the sewing room or the clean start or the escape from St. Louis. This specific warm feeling on a red rock mesa at sunset, with this specific complicated honest man." July in Caldera Creek was the kind of hot that made everything slightly dreamlike, the air shimmering above the dirt street, the colors bleached at midday, and then intensified at evening into those impossible sunset palettes. Owen and Solène moved through the heat and the light together in the easy way of people who have stopped being careful around each other. He told her everything, not just what had come out in the hearing, but all of it, the detailed texture of the years he'd been reluctant to discuss. The nights in the gang's camp when he'd lain awake hating himself. The first marshal's office and the cold terror of being found out at any moment that had never entirely left him. The patient years of building a record and a reputation that he hoped would eventually feel more real than the scared 20-year-old at its foundation. She told him about the ways she'd been forced to shape herself to fit into spaces that weren't made for her, and the toll that took, and the particular loneliness of being a woman of mixed heritage in the American West in 1883, where the laws and the customs and the daily texture of life were designed around a very specific kind of person that she was not. "I see it," he said quietly when she talked about the ways she was treated differently. "I have tried to make this town safer for people who get treated differently. I know that isn't the same as making it fair." "No," she said, "it isn't, but it matters." "I will keep trying," he said. "If you'll tell me where I fall short." "I will," she said, "and you have to actually hear it and not get defensive." "I'll work on it," he said seriously. "I mean that." She believed him. In August, Owen had an occasion to demonstrate the depth of his feeling in a way that required something more than patience. It started with a man named Darius Fitch, who arrived in Caldera Creek with a deed he claimed gave him ownership of the land the eastern adobe houses sat on, including Solene's house. The deed was, on its face, plausible, signed by a territorial land agent in Tucson. And Fitch was the kind of man who had clearly done this before, arriving in small towns with paperwork and waiting for people to be too frightened or too poor to contest it. Solène was neither frightened nor uninformed. She had the documentation of her lease agreement with Clara Hatch, who owned the land as her mother's heir, and she had a quiet and very particular fury that she wore on her face when she came to Owen's office and put the deed and her documentation on his desk. "This is fraudulent," she said. "I need to know what the actual process is for contesting it, and I need to know today." He read the deed carefully and then read her documentation and then said, "This is fraudulent," with the same certainty she'd said it, which helped. "Clara's claim is clear. The land agent's signature either isn't genuine or was obtained under false pretenses." "What can be done?" she said. "I'm going to wire the Territorial Land Office in Tucson and get a proper trace on this deed," he said. "And I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Fitch about the legal consequences of filing a fraudulent land claim in the Arizona Territory." "And if that conversation is insufficient," she asked. "Then I'm going to arrest him," Owen said, "and hold him until the territorial marshal gets here and we sort out the charges." He did all of this in exactly the order stated. The wire to Tucson confirmed within 2 days that the deed was a forgery, the signature belonging to a land agent who had died 4 months prior, and whose name had been fraudulently appropriated for at least 3 similar schemes in the territory. Darius Fitch, confronted with this information in Owen's office, attempted first to bluster, then to negotiate, and then to leave, at which point Owen arrested him with the calm efficiency of a man who has been handling exactly this kind of situation for 4 years. Fitch was in the jail cell until the territorial marshal arrived the following week, at which point he was transported to Tucson to face charges. Owen came to Solene's house that evening and told her it was resolved. She stood in her doorway and looked at him for a moment, and then she took his face in both her hands and kissed him. She had not intended to do it quite that directly or that suddenly, but she had decided sometime in the past 5 minutes that she was done being careful, that careful had its place and its time, and the time was past, and she kissed him with the complete intention of a woman who has made up her mind. He was still for one surprised moment, and then his hands came up to her waist, and he kissed her back with a thoroughness and a tenderness that she thought, distantly, Should probably not have surprised her, but somehow did, because he was always more than she expected. When they separated, he was looking at her with that changed face, the one that made him look younger. "I've been wanting to do that since April," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell, could you?" he said. "Owen," she said patiently. "I am a woman of 28 who has been paying attention for 28 years. Yes, I could tell." He laughed and she pulled him inside and they sat on her sofa together and drank coffee and talked until midnight, which was the latest he'd ever stayed. And when he left, he held her hand at the door for a long moment before walking back to the jail. The ladder-back chair stayed on the porch. She had come to think of it as a symbol now, not of waiting to be let in, but of the particular faithfulness of a man who had been content to simply be present. She kept it there even after he was coming inside every evening. September came and the heat began to ease, and the nights turned clear and cool in that particular high desert way. The stars enormous, and the silence complete, except for the coyotes and the occasional distant sound of the stage road. Owen asked her to marry him on a Saturday in September, not with any particular formality, but in the natural way of something that had become inevitable. They were walking back from the mesa in the early evening, the light going gold and long across the desert, and he stopped walking and turned to her and said, "I want to marry you. I have wanted it for some time, and I think you should know that. And I think you should know that I am not asking you to rush anything or decide anything tonight. I'm asking because you deserve to know how I feel, and I have learned that the people I love deserve to know how I feel." She looked at him. "I love you," he said. "I should say that plainly, and I'm saying it. I love you completely, including the parts of you that have been through hard things, including the walls you built and the ways you had to protect yourself. I love who you are, and I want to spend the rest of my life sitting on your porch if necessary." She took his hand. "The porch won't be necessary," she said. "You've been inside for 2 months. You know what I mean," he said. "I do," she said. "I love you too. I have loved you for longer than I admitted to myself." She looked at their joined hands. "Yes, I will marry you." He looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded and full she thought she could see every year of his life in it. The hard years and the lonely years, and the years of quiet work, and the moment this spring when she had walked into Clara Hatch's store and moved the hinges on his life. "Solène," he said, and couldn't seem to find what came after that. "I know," she said. "They told Clara Hatch first because Clara had earned it." She made a noise that could only be described as triumphant, and immediately offered her store's back room for the reception. And Solène suspected she had been planning this offer for approximately 4 months. They married in October, 6 months after Solène Navarre had come to Caldera Creek on a Tuesday stage with 2 trunks and a sewing case, and the careful composure of a woman who had stopped expecting much. The ceremony was in the church. The reception was in Clara's back room with half the town in attendance and more food than anyone needed, and a fiddle player who knew the kind of songs that make people want to dance. Owen Keller, standing at the front of that church in his good coat that Solène had mended and pressed, watching Solène walk toward him in the dress she had made herself from the finest fabric she'd ordered all season, thought that he had not deserved this. Had not deserved her trust, the specific grace of being let inside when he had given her every reason to keep the door shut. He had no language large enough for what he felt. Solène, walking down that aisle with Clara Hatch's arm through hers, because she had no family here and Clara had appointed herself to the role, thought that she had come to the Arizona territory to start over, and had instead started forward, which was a different and better thing. Starting over implies erasure. Starting forward implies carrying everything you are and moving toward something new. She reached him, and they looked at each other in the way they had both become fluent in, completely and without performance. And the preacher said the words, and they said the words back, and it was done. And Owen kissed his wife with the contained but unmistakable feeling of a man who has finally, after a very long time, arrived somewhere he was meant to be. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that feels different in retrospect than it does while you're living it. While they were living it, it was full of the practical business of two private people learning to inhabit the same space, whose habits had to flex and whose could hold, how to disagree without either retreating into silence or escalating into cruelty, how to be two distinct and capable people while also being a unit. Owen moved into the adobe house because it was larger, and because Solène's sewing business was established there, and it would have been absurd to move it. He made the small back room his own space, putting his books on shelves and a desk in the corner where he did his paperwork in the evenings rather than at the office. And the house became a place that held both of them legibly, his books and her fabrics, his gun belt on the hook by the door and her sewing basket by the window. He was home for dinner every night that circumstances allowed. She brought him lunch at the jail on days when she was in town. These were small things, but they were the architecture of a life together, and she had learned not to underestimate small things. He made good on his promise to hear her when she told him where he fell short. He was, she thought, the most sincerely trying man she had ever known. Not trying in the sense of difficult, trying in the sense of effort. He tried, constantly and genuinely, to be the person he wanted to be, and she had come to understand that this trying was itself the thing, not the achievement of some finished version of himself, but the ongoing committed act of choosing better. She loved him for it more than she could find words for, and she tried to tell him anyway, and he listened the way he listened to everything, completely. In March, a year after she had arrived in Caldera Creek on a stage from Tucson, Solène told Owen that she was expecting. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee and his evening paperwork, and she sat down across from him and said, "I need to tell you something," and he put down his pen immediately and gave her his full attention. When she told him, the expression on his face did something she had never seen it do before. All the controlled quiet broke open, just for a moment, and underneath it was something completely unguarded and enormous. His eyes went bright in the lamplight. "Are you?" he said, and stopped. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling well," she said. "A little queasy in the mornings, but well." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He held them for a long moment without speaking, and she watched him try to find the words for what he was feeling and fail to find them, and she thought that some moments were beyond language anyway, and that was all right. "I'm frightened," he said finally. "And I am happier than I have ever been in my life, and both of those things are true at the same time." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." Clara Hatch, when told, made the triumphant noise again. The pregnancy was straightforward, a mercy that Solène did not take for granted, and Owen navigated the 9 months with the particular focused care he brought to everything, learning what she needed, learning what she didn't need, specifically learning that she did not need to be treated as if she had become fragile, that she was a healthy woman with a capable body and a strong will, and the most useful thing he could do was remain exactly himself and keep dinner warm when she worked late. The baby arrived in November, a boy, born in their bedroom with the doctor in attendance, and Owen holding Solène's hand with a grip she thought might actually leave a mark, though he didn't seem aware he was doing it. She named him Samuel. Samuel Amos Keller, the second name for the marshal who had given Owen a chance. Owen held Samuel for the first time with the careful reverence of a man handling something he cannot believe he gets to hold, and he looked at his wife over the baby's head and said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Thank you." "Samuel helped," she pointed out. He laughed, which startled the baby, who made a small, indignant sound, which made Owen laugh again more softly, which made Solène think that this was the finest thing she had ever seen, and she intended to remember it with complete clarity for the rest of her life. Samuel was a calm baby, which everyone agreed was remarkable for a baby whose parents were both such self-contained people. He slept in reasonable patterns and regarded the world with the wide, considering gaze of someone taking careful notes. Clara Hatch said he was clearly very intelligent. Owen said he clearly already knew who was in charge. Caldera Creek adjusted itself around the small Keller family with the particular affectionate possessiveness of a small town that has decided something that belongs to it has come right. Owen continued as sheriff. Solène continued her business, adjusting her hours around Samuel's needs with the resourcefulness of a woman who has always managed to find a way. Clara Hatch made herself available for babysitting with a willingness that suggested she'd been waiting for the opportunity. The ladder-back chair was still on the porch. Solène had planted a climbing rose along the porch railing in the spring, a hardy variety from Clara's catalog that managed to bloom despite the desert conditions, and the chair sat among the rose canes in the warm evenings like something that had put down roots. 2 years after Samuel was born, on a warm April evening, Owen and Solène sat on the porch together in the last light. Samuel was inside asleep. The air smelled of the desert after an afternoon rain. The rose had its first blooms of the season, pale pink against the red adobe. Owen had his arm around her shoulders, and she had her head against his, and they were not talking, just sitting in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have said enough that the silences have become full rather than empty. "I have been thinking," Solène said. "About what?" He said, "About that first night I heard you put that chair outside my door," she said. "What I thought." "What did you think?" he said. "I thought you had no right," she said. "I thought you were being presumptuous, and I thought about telling you to leave and not come back." "Why didn't you?" he asked. "Because," she said, and paused for a moment, looking at the rose at the desert going purple and gold beyond the edge of town. "Because some part of me already knew that the right thing and the true thing were not going to be the same, and I have spent enough of my life choosing the right thing over the true thing." He turned his head and looked at her profile in the evening light. "The true thing was that even then, even angry, even hurt, I wanted you on the other side of that door," she said. "And I think I knew if you sat there long enough I was going to have to admit that, and so I let you sit, and eventually I opened the door, and I have not regretted it for a single day since." He pressed his lips to her temple. "Neither have I," he said. "Not a single hour." She turned to look at him, and there was everything she'd been afraid to want in his gray eyes, everything she'd nearly refused because wanting it felt too dangerous, and she thought, "I almost kept the door shut." She thought, what a different and smaller life that would have been. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "Every complicated, particular part of you." From inside the house came the small sound of Samuel stirring, and they both listened, and the sound settled back to silence, and the desert night came fully on with its enormous stars. Solène Keller sat on her porch with her husband and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely name, that the world was large and full and that she was exactly in the right place in it. Not because it was perfect. Not because the injustices of the world had resolved themselves, or the complexities had simplified, or the past had been erased. But because she was here and he was here, and they had built something true between them out of honesty and patience, and the particular courage it takes to open a door when you're afraid. The rose bloomed against the red adobe. The stars came out over the mesa. The ladder-back chair, faithful and still, held its place on the porch. Some things, once started, do not need to stop. That was not, of course, quite the end of things, because lives do not stop at the best moment. They continue into new seasons with new complications and new gifts, and so did theirs. The winter of 1886 brought a particular challenge in the form of a new set of territorial regulations that threatened to reorganize the sheriff's jurisdictions across the Southern Territory, which meant Owen's position in Caldera Creek was briefly uncertain. He came home from a wire communication with the marshal's office on a December evening and sat at the kitchen table with the particular stillness of someone processing difficult news. Solène set dinner on the table and sat across from him and waited. "There's a chance," he said, "that the new boundaries will put Caldera Creek under a different jurisdiction, which means either a new appointment or an election, and I don't know yet what the politics of it are." She studied his face. "What do you want to do?" she asked, "if it comes to that?" He looked at her. "I want to stay here," he said. "This is home." "Then we stay," she said, "and if there's an election, you run it, and you'll win." "You can't know that," he said. "I know this town," she said. "I know what you've done for it. Run it honestly and you'll win." He did not argue with her, because he had learned that arguing with Solène on matters of judgment she had thought carefully about was a reliable path to being proven wrong. The jurisdictional reorganization came through in February and required an election, and Owen ran it the way he did everything, honestly and without performance. He stood at the hotel before the town meeting and said plainly that they knew who he was and what he had done and what he'd been, all of it. And if they wanted to keep him as their sheriff, he would serve them with everything he had. And if they wanted someone else, he would understand and wish that person well. Caldera Creek voted to keep him. The vote was not close. On the evening after the vote was counted, Owen came home and found Solène at the kitchen table with Samuel, now 4 years old and deeply interested in the collection of buttons she was sorting. And he stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them in the lamplight and felt the particular weight of a life that has been built on the decision to keep trying. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, "Caldera Creek has decided to keep their somewhat complicated sheriff." Samuel looked up. "Papa," he said with the matter-of-fact directness of 4-year-olds, "you brought biscuits last time." "I didn't bring biscuits," Owen said. "I brought myself." "Next time bring biscuits," Samuel suggested. Solène caught Owen's eye over Samuel's head, and they shared the particular look of parents of small children, which is a look that contains approximately 30 different things at once. Owen came and sat at the table and helped sort buttons, which he did with the complete seriousness he brought to every task Samuel considered important, and Solène thought, "This is what I let in when I opened that door. Not just him. All of this." The spring of 1887 brought a new daughter, born at the end of April, a vigorous and opinionated baby who made her feelings about the world known from approximately 30 seconds after her arrival. They named her Marie, for Solène's mother. Her middle name was Cécile. Samuel was deeply interested in his sister in the way of 4-year-old boys, who have not yet been told that interest and ambivalence are the expected range of sibling reactions. He sat beside the cradle for long periods studying her with the wide considering gaze that was clearly inherited from his father. "She is very loud," he observed to Owen one evening. "She has opinions," Owen agreed. "About what?" Samuel asked. "Everything, apparently," Owen said. "She gets that from her mother." Solène, nursing the baby in the rocking chair across the room, said without looking up, I heard that. I know, Owen said, with the tone of a man who said it on purpose. Marie Cecile Keller grew into a person who did, in fact, have opinions about everything, and expressed them with a clarity and directness that made Clara Hatch say at least twice a year that the child was clearly exactly her mother. Owen Keller remained sheriff of Caldera Creek. He continued to run his office with the particular fairness that had always been its defining quality. And as the territory moved toward statehood and the world around them changed in the complicated ways that the West changed in the late 1880s, he adapted and held to what he believed was true. He read his history books. He talked to his horse Theodore, who lived to an impressive age. He came home for dinner every night that circumstances allowed. He never forgot what it had cost him to sit on that porch. He never forgot what it had felt like to hear her voice through the door on that night 3 weeks in, her saying, "I'm here." He carried those weeks with him not as a wound, but as a reminder of the most important thing he had ever learned. That presence, patient and unconditional, is the most honest declaration a person can make. And Solène Keller, who had come to Caldera Creek on a Tuesday stage with 2 trunks and a sewing case, and the arranged composure of a woman who had decided to stop expecting much, had discovered that expectation and hope were different things. She had spent years suppressing the first without meaning to also suppress the second, and what had come back when she'd opened the door was not just Owen but her own full capacity for it. She expanded her business in 1888, taking on an apprentice seamstress, a young woman named Agatha who had arrived on the stage from El Paso and was exactly as capable and as stubborn as Solène had been at that age, which Solène found both trying and deeply gratifying. The sewing room in the front of the house gave way to a proper shop space that she rented from Clara, 2 doors down from the general store, with a proper sign over the door and a window display that caused the wives of the silver mine operators from Benson to make special trips. She was, by every measure, a woman who had built something real. A business and a family and a place that was hers not because it was easy or without cost, but because she had chosen it and worked for it and stayed. In the evenings, in the good years and the hard years, they sat together on the porch when the weather allowed, in the rocking chair and the ladder-back chair that had never moved from its position, the rose climbing the railing beside it now thick and well established, pink blooms coming back every April without fail. Samuel grew up. Marie grew up. There were the ordinary crises of those growing-up years, the fevers and the fears and the arguments and the long, patient conversations through difficult evenings. Owen and Solène sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and talking through whatever needed talking through, because they had both learned that the talking, however hard, was better than the silence that kept things buried. They had a 3rd child in 1890, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived with Samuel's calm and Marie's opinions, and the particular combination proved interesting. Thomas took after Solène in his precision, and his patience, and his absolute refusal to be hurried when he had decided something needed careful consideration. The night Thomas was born, Owen sat by the bed in the lamplight with Solène's hand in his, and the new baby asleep in the cradle across the room and the desert night pressing warm against the window, and he said, "You know, I used to think that what I deserved was exactly what I had. Just the desk and the badge and the cot in the jail. I thought that was the appropriate scope of things for someone with my history. And now," she said. He looked at the cradle and at her face, and at the room that was full of the evidence of a life that had grown beyond anything he'd thought to reach for. "Now, I think," he said, "that deserving is maybe not the right measure. That sometimes you're given grace you didn't earn and the right response is not to question it but to take care of it. That is the wisest thing you've said since I've known you, she said, and you have said a number of wise things. Don't tell anyone, he said. It'll ruin the image. She laughed, and it was the same laugh he'd fallen in love with, the one that he had first heard properly on the mesa at sunset in the summer. They'd come to understand what they were to each other, full and unguarded and fully hers. He held her hand and they listened to the desert, and the lamplight was warm, and the baby breathed steadily in the cradle. Caldera Creek became, in the years of the early 1890s, a somewhat larger and more settled place. The stage road was supplemented by a spur rail line from Benson. The population grew. A proper courthouse was built, which made Judge Harriman very satisfied. The hotel expanded its upper floors. Clara Hatch's general store remained exactly as it had always been, because Clara Hatch had views about unnecessary change. Owen Keller was still sheriff. He had become, over the years, something that he had not anticipated and would not have claimed for himself, which was a kind of institution. The sort of person that a town organizes its understanding of itself around. Not because he was perfect or because his history was spotless, but because everyone knew the full history and had decided that the man before them, the one who showed up every day and did the work and treated people fairly and came home to his family, was more than sufficient. He had disclosed, at some point in the middle years, the full story of the Crane gang and Amos Webb's chance to a few young men who had come through his jail for minor offenses, and looked like they were at the start of roads he recognized. He told it simply, without softening or dramatizing, as an example of what a person could become if they chose to keep choosing differently. He did not know if it helped all of them. He thought it might have helped some. Solène knew he did this. He told her the first time. She had sat with it and then she had said, "That is exactly the right thing to do with a story like that." "I wasn't sure," he said. "I'm sure," she said. "The story belongs to you, use it." He used it. In 1894, Owen and Solène Keller celebrated their 15th year married, which Clara Hatch marked by organizing a party at her back room again. By now, a well-established venue for Caldera Creek's social occasions, and which the whole town seemed to treat as a civic event. Samuel was 15 and embarrassed by the party in the particular way of 15-year-old boys, which he managed with reasonable grace, because his mother had looked at him with a very specific expression when he'd suggested he might not attend, and he was not a foolish child. Marie was 11 and thought the whole thing was splendid and wore her best dress, and danced with several startled ranch hands who had not been warned she was going to ask them. Thomas was 6 and fell asleep under a table at 9 o'clock and had to be carried home by Owen, who did it with the practiced ease of a man who has carried sleeping children enough times to know how to manage a hat and a sleeping child simultaneously. Walking home that night, Owen and Solène walked slowly, the way they did when neither of them was in a hurry to stop walking, through the familiar streets of a town they knew completely, under the enormous Arizona stars. 15 years, Solène said. 15 years, he agreed. I used to tell myself I wasn't going to expect anything, she said. When I came here, I told myself the absence of expectation was wisdom. And now, he said, now I think I was confusing wisdom with self-protection, she said. Wisdom knows the difference between what is worth hoping for and what isn't. Self-protection just refuses to hope at all. And you hoped, he said. Eventually, she said. You gave me evidence to hope on. You sat on that porch and I accumulated evidence. He took her hand. They walked in the comfortable silence of people who have said the important things often enough that they don't need to always be saying them. I would sit on the porch again, he said, if it ever came to that. I know, she said, but you won't need to, because you'll open the door. He said, because, she said and looked up at him, I will open the door. Every time. It is the best thing I have ever done. They walked home through the desert town, through the warm night air, past Clara Hatch's general store with its dark windows, past the church and the schoolhouse and the hotel, down the familiar street to the adobe house with the climbing rose on the porch railing, pink and healthy and blooming even in October, which it should not strictly have been doing but had apparently decided to do regardless, because some things once started do not know how to stop. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.